Archaeology Institute. He's got interest on the use of palaeoenvironmental data for understanding our past landscapes, and he's been involved in several Highland projects. Not least I'm thinking of the one at Inverview, which I don't know, maybe we'll hear about tonight. We'll see. So Scott, over to you. Please do your stuff. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to try and share my screen then. Let's see. So can you all see the presentation okay?
No.
Not yet. Yes,
there it is.
Yeah. Perfect, thank you.
Okay, it's going through, so guessing there could be a slight delay as I change the slides, so you'll have to bear with me on that, but I'm sure it'll be fine. It'll all go okay, he said. So today then, what I've been asked to come and talk to you about is looking at new and recent paleoenvironmental work in the Highlands region. So this is not just work that I've been doing, but it's a work that a whole host of people have been doing in the area. So hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll get an appreciation for the different types of studies that are going on in the Highlands and just how active a place it is for research. And indeed, a lot of the pieces of work that I'm going to talk about in terms of what's been done previously and what's being done are of international class. They're being published in leading journals that have got a global reach. So even though it might seem that some of this work is specific to the region, it is getting out there into the wider world, and hopefully that's showing that this is a good place to not only come and study, but also to enjoy. It's a very dynamic landscape and it offers lots of different things. So today it's really more of a chat than anything else, rather than a kind of lecture. It's just about kind of talking through the region and what's going on. So what I thought I'd do to begin with is just kind of highlight what's gone in the past. I'm just going to pick a couple of studies that I've been looking up again recently, just to kind of go over and show kind of themes. Then I'm going to top that off by just looking at the kind of different research questions that have been asked in the region up to now. I'm then going to through the new and the current studies that are going on. I'm bound to have missed some, so I've probably not captured everything that's going on in the area, but hopefully it'll give you a good flavour of the types of projects that are going on in the area. And then just to top it off, I thought I'd reflect on some future directions that work might go into. These are my own ideas. They're based on my own research interests because I've been selfish that way and I'll put it in. They're not necessarily things that are bound to happen, and it's not an agenda. It's just ideas that I'm putting out there. And indeed, these aren't the outcomes of the Highland Archaeological Research Framework. Some of them might be in the future, we don't know, but these are just my own ideas and they're open for debate as well. So I'm sure other people who work in the area will have other directions and things that they want to go in. So they're just there for discussion, really. Okay, so I thought we'd start off then just by giving a bit of background information to the area and just to highlight that this is an area where lots of work has been done in the past. It's not a blank canvas, although there are areas that have been little studied. So this is the top of Scotland, minus Orkney. We don't really care about Orkney in today's lecture very much, or Shetland, or even the Western Isles. So we're going to focus then on the Highlands region. And this is from Richard Tipping's 1994 paper about the fate and form of Scotland's woodlands. It's an excellent paper. It's in Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. The reference is at the end, so I'll put the sites that I'm talking about. I'll just put 2 reference slides on at the end of the talk, so I'm sure they could be shared out amongst you in terms of where to find these papers. But in this quite substantial paper that Richard put together, he did an overview of all the different pollen sites from Scotland up to 1994. And as you can see, there are hundreds of pollen sites and quite a few in the area that we've been looking at. And this just reflects that Scotland as a whole has been an area where people have been looking at pollen records and doing palynological studies for well over 100 years now. And we've got lots of data there, but there are issues with some of that data as well. So if we look at Richard's study, again, when he looks in terms of how many of these dated sites, how many of these pollen sites actually have radiocarbon dates, secure radiocarbon dates, up to 1994, we can see that it's actually not that many. Oh, got an echo.
Carry on. We're getting you okay. I'll let you know if you're not. So go ahead. Hopefully it'll go.
Okay. So this is then a map of the Highlands region, looking at those pollen studies that have radiocarbon dates. And you can see that there's still a substantial number of pollen studies there, but we do have areas where we have less pollen data. And if we put on some of the more recent pollen studies as well that have secure radiocarbon dates, it's more standard now than in the past. We can see that there's still some areas where we don't have pollen information, where we'd like some, particularly around Inverness would be good to get some more sort of regional information there. So I've just put on this map of the Highlands area just a few studies just to kind of highlight about themes that have been coming out of previous research. And the references for all of these are on those slides at the end. So one of the big things about pollen studies really is that for a long time, they were really used as more of a botanic information than about looking at human environmental interaction. So less about the archaeology of a region and more about the vegetational history of a region. And we can see that in pollen studies such as cross locks and the lock of Windlass. So Dan Charman's work in 1994 and also Silver Pegler's work in 1979. So there's been a long history, again, of pollen studies in these regions, and they were really looking at the influx of trees after the last glaciation. When did woodlands begin? What did they look like? And less about when people were in that landscape. Although in Dan Charman's work, there is evidence of people in the landscape, and they're starting to see that evidence coming around about sort of the Neolithic, the Bronze Age period as well. But it's not highlighted as much as in maybe more recent papers we've done. It's only really in the sort of work that Kevin Edwards and Rich Timpany were doing in the 90s that really led to pollen becoming a proxy for looking at human impact in the landscape, and then looking to see how long-term that impact was, and when we can start seeing evidence for things like woodland clearance, when we can see evidence for increased charcoal, so burning episodes, sustained burning episodes, evidence for cereal pollen in the landscape, and also evidence for pastoral indicators alongside evidence of wood decline. And more recently, we've also started adding in things like non-pollen palaeomorph data, so looking for dung fungi and other kind of fungal evidence as well for people in this landscape. One of the things that is less often now, and you'll be able to see from this map, that pollen is still quite frequent. It's still the main proxy evidence really for looking at long-term vegetational change, but also for looking at that kind of regional signal and looking at evidence for people in the landscape. But people like Sylvia Peglar and Hilary Burks back in the 70s and the 80s, they were also doing waterlogged plant remains. And that's really important because unlike pollen, it seems to have died a bit of a death recently. So as well as looking at pollen intervals through a core, they're also looking at the waterlogged plant remains, which is the seeds, the buds, wood fragments, all of these that you get in pollen cores. And that's really giving you that local information. But it's also really important in terms of thinking about species diversity, what biodiversity you've got and how far back these things go, and also species richness of these vegetational communities. And we don't do that so much anymore, but we will come back onto this. But it was done in the 70s and 80s, and there's less of that kind of information going on now. We've also got things, pollen studies that are related to looking at climatic change. So if we look at Kelly et al.'s paper from 2017, they use pollen and tephra to look at the impact of volcanic activity on vegetation and to see if there is an impact on these. They also found one of the only records for certain tephra. So
Scott, you've gone on mute. You might need to unmute yourself. Hang on, let me see if I can.
Must have moved my mouse. So I was just talking about the Kelly et al. Paper and how they've been able to find the evidence of tephra in the region. And one of the tephra they found is the only record of this tephra across Scotland. And I've got the name of it somewhere because it's obviously going to be one of those that's difficult to say. Yeah, the Askja S tephra, which has been found throughout Scandinavia and dates to around about 10,900 BC. So we're talking about volcanic eruptions and having evidence of these around about the end of the Loch Lomond readvance. So we're talking, right into the early Holocene. And they also have evidence for the Andruan tephra as well, which is around about 9,600. So we're also not only looking at pollen and vegetation change, but all evidence to see how big climatic events such as volcanic activity, which can lead to climatic events, can have an impact on regions. And then we've also got more evidence for vegetation records with people. So we've got evidence from Rich Tipping and Alfie Davies et study Loch Followay, where they found evidence of pine stumps that had metal axe marks in them. So we've got Neolithic pine stumps with Bronze Age axe marks. And from looking at these pine stumps, which we have great evidence for this area, particularly from the work of Hilary Burks and also from Hilary Burks' work in 1975, the seminal paper of mapping these pine stumps across the area. We can actually go back now and kind of look at these in terms of, do they represent the decline of pine woodland across regions? Is that driven by climatic change? Is it driven by human action? And interestingly, at Loch Followay, Tipping et al. Suggests that there's a second stage of pine woodland development at around about 5,000 BC. And that's basically led by human action. So human action and increased grazing pressure has led to the demise of the more deciduous woodland, and it's allowed pockets of open spaces for pine woodlands to establish. And interestingly, that's also something that Dan Charman picked up on at Crosslocks as well, where he also has a second phase of pine woodland in this area. And pine is a good one to study because it is climatically sensitive. So it's interesting to see how that responds to climate within these areas, particularly when we talk more about conservation going forward. So evidence activity in charcoal, so from areas like the leg, Tipping again, Rob McCulloch, Melanie Smith, et al., where we've got these multi-proxy surveys. So not only are we taking pollen cores, but we're taking more than one pollen core across these areas. And that's also something that Dan Charman did in Crosslocks as well, where you can talk Green and Edwards in Northern Skye as well. And that's quite interesting because if the more cores you have, then you're able to see differences within those vegetation profiles. So just having one pollen record in your area may not mean that you're picking up everything that's going on. If you look at their volume, you'll see that in between pollen cores, there's different rates for when they start picking up human activities. So in one core, they're picking up human activity right at the beginning of the Neolithic. Another, talking a few hundred meters away, they're picking up in Paleolithic, which doesn't sound very much, but it's 1,000 years difference in terms of picking up those kind of signals in the area. So if you've only got one core, you might have the better chance you've got of picking these things up. And that's a brilliant study as well because it combines methods. So the more methods you can combine, the bigger story you're going to get. So LEG, they were able to combine pollen, but they also had charred plant remain evidence. So that's giving you evidence for agriculture, from cereal grains from the Neolithic, where you've got naked barley and emmer wheat, through to the Bronze Age, where you've got naked barley and hull barley. You're seeing that switch at that time, and into the Iron Age, where you're seeing that 6-row hull barley become predominant. And also, this is one of the few sites that has post-medieval evidence as well, 18th, 19th century buildings where they're also getting grain for oats and barley evidence. And we've got the charcoal evidence from these as well, so we can see how the charcoal is reflected in the woodlands. So that's really good. We can see that we've got pollen evidence for pine, we've got pollen evidence for some oak, we've got pollen evidence for birch. And when we look at the charcoal records across these periods, we can see that reflected. We can see people using all the charcoal, hazel charcoal, birch charcoal. It's all there, and that gives us some further evidence that the kind of signal we're picking up is reflecting the kind of trees that people are using. And we've also got from Mike Cressey's work at Seafield as well, where they've got Iron Age buildings, as well as some Bronze Age evidence. And here again, we're seeing that 6-row hull barley coming through in terms of the main agricultural crop. There's some evidence of oat here as well, which is pretty good for the Iron Age to start getting some oat evidence in. And again, we're seeing charcoal reflective of oak, mainly from metalworking evidence. So we're seeing oak being used to burn for that kind of activity, as well as things like pine, alder, birch, etc. So when we put all of this kind of things together, these kind of previous studies, we can see that within this region, we're already starting to learn a lot about agriculture. We're starting to learn a lot about the vegetational history. We're starting to see big evidence for big events such as volcanic activity. We're starting to see evidence for wood use as well. And we've also got that in Freswick, where we've got a Norse and Pictish site. And that's quite interesting because, again, this is evidence. This is a coastal site, so this was revealed through coastal erosion, and people want to go and save it. And we've got evidence again of the Norse coming through here, so we can actually see within the Norse they're also growing hull barley and oats, and that's quite interesting. We've also got evidence for that up in Westray in Orkney as well. But one of the things that they looked at when they had the child plant remains is that they found evidence for wild taxa, for weed seeds that grow in clay soils, but also sandy soils. And they're suggesting that they're getting crops coming in from different fields, different locations, and they don't have a lot of chaff. The material that you lose when you process it. And so it might be that actually what they suggest is they might not actually have evidence for local cultivation here, but it may be that people are bringing grain in, and that could be through trading, etc. And nearby pollen record also doesn't pick up very much activity for agriculture during the Norse period. So even though we get evidence, we can always question that. So that's kind of a brief overview of a few sites. The Highlands has also been subject to regional reviews. So in Rosie Bishop's done a lot of work with this, together with people like Mike Church. So the one on the left here, Bishop Tale 2015, is a review of Mesolithic sites across Scotland, and looking at evidence to see what plant resources people are using in terms of wild food gathering. So obviously lots of evidence for things like hazelnuts, but also things like apples and stuff. And also looking to see what fuel they're burning as well. And the one on the right is, again, another review that was done earlier. Again, the same group of people really, looking at Neolithic sites across Scotland, again, looking to see what were the main cultivars that were being grown, any evidence for wild food use as well. But if we look at those across this region, there's definitely scope for more work to be done. The Mesolithic sites, there's only 4 really from this paper that are within the Highlands, and the Neolithic sites really as well. So, you know, can we base the whole of the Mesolithic on those 4 sites? Can we base the whole of the Neolithic on those 7 sites? So you can see that, you know, the more information we can get, then the more detailed we can make these maps, and the better understanding we'll get of how people utilise that landscape in the past. And I'm sure in the future there'll be reviews on the Bronze Age and the Iron Age as well, but haven't quite got there on those yet. So thinking about what past studies have occurred then in this region gives us a chance to kind of give an overview of some of the main research questions that people have had in the past. So we can see there's been a lot of questions about vegetational change. So what were the main drivers of those change? Was it people? Was it climate? Did things like volcanic activity have an impact? Tree migration, the establishment of woodland, how long that woodland lasted in the Highlands, reasons for its demise, and then things like the elm and the pine decline, the elm decline has been found to some extent on a few sites. So this is an occurrence that happens around about the beginning of the Neolithic. where across the UK and in Europe, we see a decline in elm, which has been linked to human activity, climate, and disease as well. And then at the beginning of the Bronze Age, we also have this pine decline that occurs across Scotland. And again, there's more evidence for that, but we also have there's what these studies are showing is that there's no real clear line. In some areas the pine decline occurs and the elm decline occur, pretty rapidly, and in others pine hangs on, elm hangs on. It can be a two-stage decline, etc. We've got evidence for anthropogenic activity, so we started to look to see the beginnings of agriculture, so things like the Bishop et al. Review, sites like Legg are giving us that information as to when agriculture started in the Highlands. How did it change over time? Places like Seafield, how that economy changed. Things like diet, what people were eating. Also things like trade as well. So if we think and from charcoal evidence, we're starting to see evidence for wood fuel use and selection as well. And that seems to be reflecting what the pollen's saying about the local. Also from work that Alfie has been doing in places like Glen Affric, along with tipping, we're starting now to look at these long-term records that we've got. And we can see we had lots of them from pollen studies, and think about how we can apply those to modern ecological issues. And we'll come on to that a bit later. And we've also got those paleoclimates, so looking at things like tephra, volcanic ash. And I haven't spoken about it, but there's also evidence for climatic shifts in terms of when it was wetter and when it was dry in the past. But looking at things like sphagnum mosses in raised peat bogs to see when we get evidence of sphagnum that like more wet conditions and those that like slightly dry conditions, and see if we can relate that to climatic change. And when we find them to archaeological evidence in the area to see if it correlates with when people were on the right there. That's just the one of the maps from Henry Burke's paper in 1975, looking at where pine stumps have been found across the Highlands, and there's an updated map from that in her 80s paper as well. So that's an overview of things that have happened. And now I'd like to just move on to things that are happening. So new current studies that are going on. Here's the locations of the sites that I'm going to mention. You can see that we've added a few more things. Dendrochronology is now in there. Maybe that wasn't done so much in the past, but there's lots of exciting dendrochronology work going on by people like Coralie Mills and Anne Crone across Scotland, and the Highlands is part of that. There's still lots of pollen. You'll see that pollen is still the main one there. There's no real waterlogged plant remains. There's a little bit going on, but not so much. And then again, we've got child plant remains and charcoal as well. So the first study I'd like to talk about then is Annabelle Everard's PhD project. So Annabelle is a student at Aberdeen University, and it's been supervised by people also at University, Queen's University Belfast. And the work that Annabelle is native woodlands of Scotland, really, and also we'll be looking at those in Ireland. So if you haven't found the Forestry Commission ancient woodland surveys online, then I definitely recommend you go and find those and have a look at them. They're really good to get a sense of just how much ancient woodland there is across Scotland that's left. Again, these are semi-ancient woodlands that have been surveyed, which means that we can only trace the woodland back to our earliest maps of that area to show that woodland was around. And how accurate these maps are always varies, and anybody looking at historical documentation, and if you've done archive research for yourselves, you'll realise that there is quite a bit of variation in maps. But how far back do these woodlands go? How can we get that information when we don't have maps? So what Annabelle's doing is she's targeting ancient woodlands such as the Atlantic hazel woodlands on the west coast to look to see how far back they go in the past. So how long have they been around? So we're going to be doing this by looking at pollen through woodland hollows to see how far back we can get. And also we're going to be doing waterlogged plant remains again. So waterlogged plant remains, as I said before, they're really important because, so from pollen, we can say there's birch trees there, but are they silver birch? Are they downy birch? We don't know unless we get the seeds. Willow's the same. We can say we have willow trees, but is it goat willow? Is it grey willow? We don't know until we get the seeds. So we need that to order to be able to get the species of the kind of trees that we're looking at, but also it gives you an indication of how species rich the field layers were for these woodlands. So in the picture there, sorry, you can see coppice tree. You can see it coming up where it's been cut previously, and you can also see the woodland floor is pretty species poor. Really, it's leaf litter going through. But if woodlands, sometimes they're more open, sometimes they're more dense, and you'll get fluctuations in the field layer through there. There's also plants such as wood anemone, which is an ancient woodland indicator in pollen records. So if you look at the work of Petra Dark, for example, in Oxfordshire, these are plants that they identify as being, if you've got them, it's an ancient woodland. So it takes woodlands a certain stage, a certain number of years for these plants to then come in and then invade. So essentially, you're saying this woodland was well established for these plants to be there. And because we're looking at pollen, we can also look to see, have we got evidence of people in these woodlands? Have we got evidence of grazing? And what effect did that have on woodlands? And, if you look back at papers by Richard and Althea a lot farther away, and also if you look at the leg material with Melanie, so if we can see that grazing actually is very much underplayed as a role for woodland reduction and also for maintaining open areas. Grazing has a massive impact, and it's one of those things that we haven't quite got to grips yet fully with in pollen records, about how we evidence that as well. So it could have had, just as equal an impact as chopping down trees as well. And then we'll also be looking to address questions: are these woodlands truly ancient? So targeted woodland there, looking at the native woodlands of the Highland region and their biodiversity. We've also got work coming up from an MRes student, Hannah, who's going to be talking on Thursday, so I'm not going to say too much about the work that she's doing, but she's looking at pollen evidence at Gairloch from a peat bog, which is surrounded by hut circles. It's the work that the Wee Diggs and Anna Welty, who's here, have been doing. They've found now across the area of Westeros something like 400, 500 hut circles. But we don't know too much about them in terms of how were the communities of these hut circles interacting with their local environment. So on the excavations that Anna did, they managed to get some evidence for charcoal, etc. We did some limited pollen, but now we're going to be able to have longer pollen sequences, and we've got some dates back which Hannah will talk about, and we've definitely got the period of the hut circles, which is excellent, and we're within meters of some of these hut circles as well. So it'd be good to kind of see if we can get evidence for how people are utilising their environment, whether it's continuous occupation in these areas or whether we've got periods where lots of people were in that region and then there's a lull in activity and then people coming back again. We also want to look at how people are resourcing wood fuel. So did it have an impact on woodlands? Again, is grazing important? And then we think there's probably evidence for metalworking going on. It's Bronze Age, it's Iron Age. So did that metalworking have an impact on the environment as well? So we can look at things like geochemical analysis, what heavy metals are within the peatland that we're looking at, to see if we've got any evidence of with increased microscopic charcoal from burning activity. And just to say that, there's been no real work on paleoenvironmental records and association with hut circles for years. Now there's two, so they've come along as buses, and there's also a PhD student who's just starting at St Andrews University in a collaboration with Stirling University, and we'll be looking at another peat bog next to hut circles on the National Trust of Scotland land, which is just round the corner pretty much from this site. So that both of those should give us a really good understanding now of how people are interacting with the environment in these locations. Sticking with the there's lots of excavation activity recently by AOC Archaeology, and they've been kind enough to lend me some slides just to kind of illustrate this. So they've been working at Clachtol Broch as one of their sites, and you can see very substantial site, but but amazingly, within one of these knocking stones that they found at the site, when they uncovered it, it was absolutely teeming full of charred cereal grain. And you can see here that after they've cut it, so there it is, there's a section through it. You see how deep it is. It looks like a good kind of 10 centimeters. And then that's what it looks like after they've removed the grain. So whereas with the pollen evidence from places like Gairloch and the other site that will be looking, we're going to see if we can find evidence for agriculture in the landscape from the pollen evidence. And pollen is tricky because you have to be located quite close to where that agriculture is taking place, because cereal pollen grains are quite large. They're one of the largest pollen grains. They don't travel too far away from where you have that agriculture taking place. And you might only get one or two cereal pollen grains, whereas if we're looking at charred plant remains, we can often get hundreds and thousands of grains from different sites. So from this Iron Age site, you can see there's lots of grain. If we look at the grain, we can see that's pretty much all hulled 6-row barley. I think we can all agree on that one. And if you think back to sites like Legg and sites like Seafield West, again, that seems to be the main crop that was grown in the Iron Age. So again, we've got previous research that we can go off to see, what the main cultivars of this area are. It's been dated to 50 BC. And they've got other evidence in there as well. It's amazing preservation they have at this site, where they're going to be able to tell us lots of really interesting information about cereal cultivation in this part of the world in the Iron Age, but also about processing as well. And one of the things that they found is not just grain, but they also have evidence of unprocessed barley. And that's really interesting because when we look at charred cereal grain, often what we're looking at is accidental burning. So it has to have been burnt accidentally to preserve. So it could have been a drying kiln incident. It could have been grain that's been burnt from dropping onto the hearth, etc. And that can vary. So if you're looking at grain on a hearth, often you've only got small quantities of grain coming out. If you've got a whole kiln or something that's burnt down, you can get vast quantities of grain. And this is somewhere in between the two, really. We've got good evidence of lots of grain coming from this site, and it's suggestive that some of it might have been stored here. So we've got evidence of storage on site, and storage is important because we can think about it in terms of often pits. You find charred grain in pits. Is that evidence of storage? But also in terms of processing. So to get evidence of processing on site, we're looking for chaff fragments. So we're looking for evidence of the rachis, the spikelets that hold the grain in place. And here we've got potentially a whole sheaf of unprocessed barley, suggesting this is how it's being stored within the building. And then when they come to use it, it's being then dried and ground, etc. As well. So it's telling us about daily use of the cereals as well as what they're actually growing. And that's all quite important evidence, because then we can compare it to other sites like Culduthel in Inverness. So this is an Iron Age village, pretty much, located pretty close to Inverness, just on the outskirts. You'll drive by Culduthel if you're approaching it from the south. And here we've got massive Iron Age roundhouses. You can see this is one of them. You can see these are the post holes. So very large. You can see people standing in the post holes. I can try and zoom in on it. So you can see just how big some of these are. So quite substantial trees that were being used to construct these. And when you look at the phasing of some of these roundhouses, you realise that they can have several phases where they just get bigger and bigger, and they have things like porches added onto them, suggesting that the wealth of the site is increasing through the Iron Age. And it's a site that's got really good metalworking activity, but also these deposits that we just saw from Clark, but nevertheless pretty significant. And from this site as well, you can see here in the graph at the bottom, we've got mainly hull barley. So again, it's matching that pattern that we know about in the Iron Age. We've got some oats coming through later, which matches what we saw at Seafield West, and not very much wheat. And that sort of pattern that we also see from these Iron Age sites. We see the occasional smattering of wheat, but not masses of it. Interestingly, at Culduthel, we have quite a bit of spelt wheat, from the latter stages, which is pretty much a Roman introduction. So this might be suggesting that there is trade with the Romans going on at this site, and indeed there's Roman coins, there's Roman glass, and and other evidence suggests that there might be trading for metalworking. Within the grain assemblage as well from this site, there's not very much chaff at all, and it suggests that they're not growing the grain here. So much like we were seeing at Freswick for the Norse, it looks like grain's being brought to the site, and it could have been brought to trade for the metalworking objects, and that this is very much an artisan metalworking site rather than a farming community. And that grain is then being brought in through time. There's also evidence of other wild foods that's being used. So this is quite nice. This is a domestic plum fruit stone that we found in one of the furnaces. So you can just imagine people as they're eating, just throwing the remains into the furnaces. So we've done a fair bit of work on the archaeobotany. We didn't do very much work on the charcoal. So now we've got a project ongoing looking at charcoal from these metalworking kilns. So here's one of the kilns, and when this was excavated, it was absolutely ram-packed full of charcoal. And in the same way that we've seen with previous charcoal studies, we want to know if the charcoal used in the kilns reflects the local environment, reflects the woodland around it. We don't have very good pollen records for Inverness, so it'd be interesting to compare this to places like Seafield West, which are a relatively similar date, and we'll be able to see if we're getting the same species coming out of it. We know we've got a fair bit of oak in these, so it'd be interesting to compare our furnaces with what they were doing. But the other thing that we want to look at is there evidence for woodland management? So how sustainable is the metalworking activity at these sites? If it's been going for a long time, then surely you want to preserve the amount of timber that you've got, the amount of wood fuel that you've got. You're going to need it. It's quite important in terms of making those metal objects. So can we see evidence for things like coppicing, etc., coming through from the charcoal? And how do we look at that? So one of the key ways we can look at it is through the ring curvature of charcoal fragments. So this is a charcoal fragment not from Culduthor Mustad, it's from a burnt mound site. But you can see it's quite a good one. It looks like it's got a grumpy face. It's got two eyes and a mouth. But these mouths and these rings are the growth rings. So what we're actually seeing here is that it's got quite strong growth rings. They're very strongly curved, which suggests this is branch wood. And if we had curves that were quite straight, very weakly curved, then that would be more reminiscent of trunk wood. So one of the things we want to do is look to see, have we got more trunk wood being used in the kilns, which would suggest that people are readily chopping down trees to use for fuel wood? Or do we have more branch wood? Is it that people are actually sustainably managing their fuel wood resource? Or is the periods where they're not periods where they have chopped down trees, they've got less woodland, so then they start, utilising branches more to try and manage what they've got left? So we don't know that yet, but that's one of the questions we're going to be looking at over the next few months. And then we can see other evidence in this charcoal. So those things that look like eyes that you can see, these are actually called radial cracks. And this happens to wood when it's just been cut. So if it's green wood and it's just been burnt, it often has these radial cracks. So again, we can also check to see, is it freshly cut wood that's been burnt or has it been stored? And if this had little circles, little holes in it, we would suggest it had evidence of insect damage. And if it's got evidence of insect damage, then it's probably been stored for a while. And therefore we can kind of check those when we're doing the charcoal to see, what evidence we've got for storage, what evidence we've got for potential woodland management. So we don't just have to identify the wood from the charcoal, we can get loads more information out of it than we've currently got. Also in the Iron Age, which seems to be having a sudden renaissance in terms of studies going on in the Highlands at the minute. We've got a new site at Swartigill, which Martin Carruthers is digging. And again, this is another different kind of Iron Age site. So we've got brocks that are being excavated. We've got Iron Age villages with massive roundhouses that are being excavated. And then we've got these other sites as well. So other kinds of domestic buildings that are less monumental and maybe more everyday. As well, and you can see here, just if you've got sharp eyes, that there's at least a couple of stages of development going on at this site as well. So we can see evidence for wall, out wall, inner wall. There's reorganisation going on, and we also have evidence for later Norse activity on this site. We've got nice hearths as well. So again, we're starting to get, and this also is, this is up in Caithness. So we've got, sites in the west of Scotland. We've got sites in Caithness. We've got sites in Inverness. We haven't looked at the grain yet from this site, but is it going to be hull barley? Is it going to be hulled and naked barley? How much oat is there? Is there any evidence of wheat at all? Have we got evidence for processing? If this is a kind of domestic site, then we might have more evidence of cereal processing, albeit at lesser quantities here than we've seen, a place like Culduthel. Yet at Clactol, there is potential evidence of processing and storage. So what can this add to our story? The other thing is, what evidence has it got for woodland in the terms of the charcoal? Has it got evidence of turf burning, of peat burning? Or can we see evidence of woodland surviving here as well? And does that charcoal match up with things like the ancient woodland surveys that have taken place? So can we see upland birch woodland in the charcoal? Can we see native pine, etc. coming through? So again, lots of evidence in the Iron Age coming through all of a sudden. In the Highlands, so this will be a period that hopefully we'll know about how people are interacting with the landscape and what that landscape would have looked like in the next few years. We've also got more community group action going on. So we've had the We Digs group, and we've also got Taradale Through Time, who have been digging at areas such as Balvatti and Gilchrist as well. And here we've got a multi-proxy approach going on, because we do have some pollen cores that were taken from a kettle hole at Gilchrist as well. We've just sent off for, I think it's 11 radiocarbon dates now. So we've got dates that'll be coming through from Balvatti and through Gilchrist to tell us what length of time these sites have been occupied, and give us some dates to be able to compare these sites to the wider area. We're hoping to do some pollen as well, and hopefully the dates from the pollen monolith will allow us to see if that vegetation information within there is going to correspond with the occupation activity that was taking place. And we've done some assessment of the charred plant remains as well from this site. And you can see that we've got some nice hull barley grains. So again, these kind of 6-row hull barley. We've got some evidence of rachis fragments. So there's some evidence of potentially small-scale cereal processing going on in these sites as well. And quite nicely within the charred plant remains, we also have these, which are buds. These are probably birch buds. They're charred birch buds. So you can see that people have been collecting their wood fuel in the spring, in this instance. And these were still attached to the twigs, the branches, when they were burnt. And there is some very nice roundwood charcoal evidence from this site as well. So hopefully, again, linking that into woodland management. Was woodland resource quite scarce? Can we see that from the pollen? And can we link, the charcoal to that and say that people might have been more sustainably managing their wood fuel resource? So all of a sudden we can start, getting lots of evidence for these sort of things. Another field that's taking off is palaeoecology and conservation. So the work that Althea and Richard were doing in places like Glenafric now, it's starting to spread out more. And Melanie Smith as well is contributing to this kind of work. So Jasmine, who's going to be talking on Thursday, she's been looking at 3 sites in the north of the Highlands, so 2 in Caithness and 1 in Sutherland. And there we've been working alongside what was the Forestry Commission of Scotland, and I think they've changed their name now again, to look to see, what native woodland was around in these areas. They're all areas that are owned. They're all forestry areas. In terms of then wondering about the validity of replacing some of these peatlands. So at the minute, all of these peat bogs have got monocultures of fir and other coniferous non-native trees on top of them, and they're all areas of timber industry and ag industry. But we've been trying to look at these peat bogs in terms of conservation, and they've been essentially returning some of these land to native peatlands, blocking up drainage ditches, allowing the peat bogs to take back this land. But also they're now thinking, can they replant some of the native woodlands? So Jasmine Study's been looking at what those native woodlands would have been, and thinking about what are the best trees there then to plant going forward. So how can we look at future climatic records and say which is good and may survive, or which ones wouldn't be that great to replace on these areas? And I'll let Jasmine talk about that. later on. But this work as well riffs off work that Althea Davies has been doing for a long time now across Scotland, and she's got sites such as Migdale, etc., within the Highlands. And here we've been looking at using pollen as long-term records. So a lot of ecological records that are considered long-term might only be a decade or a few decades old. Whereas when we take pollen cores from these blanket bogs or rose bog environments, we've often got thousands of years worth of data. And that's important because it means that we can look to see how vegetation responds to things like climate change and human impact over long periods, and also things like grazing as well, which Althea is starting to bring more into the fore in terms of thinking about this as having a major impact on woodland as well. And this also ties back to the work that Annabelle's going to be doing, because it's looking at some of these fragmented woodlands. So they're pockets of woodland that would have been much greater in extent that are now smaller pockets, and trying to establish what the biodiversity record is like within these areas. So we might have evidence in the past for species that are no longer there. And when we look at these woodlands and how these woodlands have changed, often in the pollen, so for example, the pollen diagram here, you can see, for example, if we look, we can see evidence of birch, we can see evidence of oak, we can see evidence of alder, but it's not really telling us about what that looks like on the ground in terms of the canopy layer. So is it a mosaic? Is it mainly all birch with a pocket of alder somewhere and a pocket of oak? Is there stands of pine within it? Etc. So trying to unpick all this is something that Alfie has been doing, and then looking at this in terms of, if we look at the woodland now, we can see things like scattered oak. Has it always been like that in the past, or is this something that's only now starting to happen? And if so, is this a long-term effect, or is this a short-term effect? So we're looking at these records now to work with modern conservationists in terms of what should be, alongside with what Jasmine's doing, what's the sort of woodland we should be replanting in this area? What are the sort of trees that have got a better chance of surviving future climatic impacts, raising temperature, changes in hydrology than other trees? So if we think about pine, for example, we know from previous studies and also studies like this that it's quite sensitive to climatic change. So would it be a good one to plant, or would things like birch, which aren't so sensitive and thrive across the Highlands of Scotland, particularly these upland birch woodlands, which are really important, would they be the good ones to kind of concentrate on going forward? And if so, what does that do to our diversity? So we've got lots of things like that going on. And then we've also got students. So I don't know too much about these, I'm afraid. But there are student projects going on, again, in the Highlands, which are, again, looking at modern ecological problems, but using past paleoecological solutions. So Annabelle, again, who's on the native woodlands, did some work on the blanket bogs of Balmoral. We've also got evidence of grazing history, and again, looking at climate and ecology. And then we've also got a lot of dendrochronology work going on in the area, so looking at tree ring evidence. And one of the things that people like Coralie Mills and also Anne Crone have been doing is trying to source this information. So a lot of the dendrochronological records that we want are actually wrapped up in building timbers. So in terms of historic building recording, we need to have things like dendrochronological samples through those timbers in order to get that record. And that's not only useful in terms of they might have climatic signals within them, but also they can tell you, using a dendro, we can see if this is local pine or if this is non-native pine. And the same with things like oak as well. And then there's lots of other potential to look at other trees. So things like ash we haven't done yet, elm we haven't done yet, yew, all of these things could make great dendrochronological records. But one of the problems that Coralie and Anne are finding is access to this material gets less frequent all the time. Often historic building recordings where we have these timbers, there isn't a consent or an agreement in to actually get the dendro samples. And indeed, Coralie was saying in an email that they recently rescued dendro material from a skip from a building as well, just to get the records. So that's commitment for you, a bit of skip diving to get those dendrochronological records. But they are having great success. They are getting success in terms of they are establishing, oak, native oak and native pine sequences as well. But, with all things, funding is always an issue. For example, in historic England, They've spent more on dendro than radiocarbon dates, but here we have a radiocarbon dating fund, which is absolutely brilliant. We don't necessarily have a dendro dating fund at all. So some of this data is going missing. And the thing to remember with all of these things, archaeology itself, peat bogs even, they're a finite resource in a way. So if we don't have access to these things now, if we're not getting these records, then we're going to lose them, and we're going to lose all that important information. It's the same with peat bogs. When a road goes through it, if we don't have a core, we don't have a record, we lose it. Archaeology, where if we don't sample correctly, we lose that information, etc. as well. So there's all these kind of constraints that are going on. So that's kind of a quick overview, really, of just the breadth of work that's going on across the Highlands region as we speak. And as I was saying, I'm sure there's probably more than this going on. And just to say that, within the Highlands, there's lots and lots of potential for more dendro records. There's a few there you can see, and that's really been good at establishing native pine. And again, hopefully what's coming through is that pine's really important. It's a really important tree in the Highland region, and records of it are really useful. So if we look then at those kind of studies, then we can see that there's been a bit of a shift in terms of the current research questions as compared to the old research questions. So the ones we're looking at, vegetational change in terms of long-term, just establishing those vegetational records without necessarily directing them in terms of looking for human activity. There's been some archaeological excavations, and there's links to those in terms of child plant remains and charcoal, and then also the tephra. But now what we're starting to see is that we're starting to get more interested in what is the native woodland of the Highlands region and indeed Scotland. How can we look at that? How can we investigate that? We are starting to look more at human environmental interactions. So we're now targeting pollen samples around archaeological sites, whereas before we were just targeting pollen samples on an available peat bog and available loch to get that information. We're starting to see a focus on later prehistoric agricultural economy from the sites I've been showing you. The Iron Age is suddenly bursting. We're starting to get more information about the Iron Age. That's going to be great going forward. But we can also look at questions about subsistence versus intensive agriculture. So if we've got evidence for Neolithic, which we haven't spoken about too much here, or maybe some of those smaller Iron Age buildings, we can look to see, is it subsistence or is it more intensive agricultural practices as well? And if you think about all that grain from Clactor, then maybe they have got quite intensive agriculture going on. We're also looking at fuel use and woodland impact, so how people are using their trees. We've got much more work going on now, thanks to the foundations that were laid by Richard and particularly Althea in terms of palaeoecology and woodland restoration. Thanks to the work of Anne and Coralie, we've got lots of information now. We're starting to get information about native Scottish pine. We're starting to tie this into the landscape, tie it back into woodland. We can get environmental and climatic histories as well from these buildings, not only dating the buildings themselves, dendrochronology being far more accurate than radiocarbon dating when available, but we're starting to use those to see, if we can tie that into other climatic effects from those tree records. And then we're starting to get information about prehistoric industry that's starting to take off. So things like Seafield, we've now been able to move that on with Cool Duthel as well, and the work from around Gairloch, and hopefully having paleo pollution impact on the landscape as well, and seeing what impact this prehistoric metalworking did have. So that's kind of an overview of that. And then lastly, just to kind of round it off, I thought I'd just go through a few, not many, don't worry, kind of future directions about where we might go to with work that's coming up. So one of the things that Hannah's also doing is she's working on placement activity with the Staffin Eco Museum. And what they're looking at is they're looking at their landscape in a kind of archaeotourism way. So it's looking across the landscape to see where we have evidence of Mesolithic activity. So all the work that Caroline Wickham-Jones and Karen Hardy did, and the work previously in the pollen of Kevin Edwards et al., looking at the Mesolithic activity in this area and Scotland's first settlers project. They're targeting those sites, but they're also targeting post-medieval townships, Iron Age sites, and using these as potential walks that people can go on around the landscape. So being able to investigate this landscape and kind of experience this landscape for yourself. But can we also tie that with research? So we've done a few, Dan Lee has done some excavation there, again, of sort of Mesolithic sites. But there's loads of potential for coring, there's loads of potential for other things. So can we use archaeotourism as a pathway into doing more research in these areas? And then using the information from the research to put back into information for guided walks, for site visits, all of these things. Is that a future direction that we can go in, that we can use? Another thing that we haven't talked about really, apart from sort of coastal erosion associated with Freswick, is a submerged landscape around the Highlands. So can we look at intertidal peats, for example? Can we find evidence of submerged forests as well? There are some intertidal peats. I had a master's student looking at intertidal peats around the west coast of Scotland, and they came up with a few locations for where there's evidence of peats. Is there evidence of tree remains here as well? Can we look at these in terms of, you know, the Mesolithic landscape? Evidence of the Mesolithic, but as that study by Rosie showed, there's only 4 sites. So can we get from 4 sites to foreshore sites and have a look to see what's going on in these areas, and evidence for native woodlands from submerged forests, but also maybe evidence for Mesolithic activities such as reed swamp burning, etc. as well, and how people use the wetlands. The work that Annabelle's been doing and previously by Hilary Burks, etc., is looking at native woodland character. Can we take this further? Can we be looking at, you know, more sites in the area, more tie this in with the ancient woodland survey that's been done by the Forestry Commission? Can we look at dendrochronology records through these as well, from things like oak coppice? Can we get a sense for how old these are? Do they match up with estate maps as well? How far back do they go? And how rich were they in terms of their species diversity? So what kind of species richness did they have? We can also use things like submerged forests for this, because they're the actual forest. They are the forest from the past. So we can actually go and stand in a Neolithic forest. You can still go and do that. And key to this is combining methods. It's combining pollen with things like waterlogged plant remains to get that field layer information. Again, we've looked at woodland in terms of fuel use. Can we also look at it in terms of cremation pyre use? So can we look at the charcoal and think about it in terms of, are there specific trees that were being used for cremation pyre? Is it just what's to hand, or were people deliberately choosing types of trees for their pyre information? How does this relate to pollen records? How does this relate to other wood that's been used on site? So if, for example, you're looking at a Bronze Age site and you might have metalworking activity, is the fuel they use for the metalworking activity the same as for the cremation activity, or are they different? And what does this say about the cultural significance of woodlands? There's lots of folklore, there's lots of folk stories about woodland showing that people have different views on it and reflecting it in different ways. There's lots of new literature coming out about green exercise. Going into woodlands makes you feel good. You know, there's health benefits to that. So can we look at, see, you know, what is this cultural significance of woodlands, and particularly, you know, things like the pine woodlands, things like those upland birch woodlands across the Highlands area. What's significant about these? And again, things like dendrochronology can help with this as well. Prehistoric agricultural practices. We're starting to get Iron Age, lots more Iron Age evidence now, but what else is there? We don't have too much Neolithic evidence. You know, we've got those 7 sites that Rosie Bishop et al. Was talking about. But can we see more evidence? Can we see evidence for things like naked barley grains and emmer? Can we see evidence of crop processing? So things like spikelet fragments as well on sites. Can we see evidence of changes through time? So in terms of the Neolithic, we might have 2 sites that are very close. They seem quite similar, but are they growing different crops? Are they growing different quantities of crops? Are they trading with each other? You know, how does it all work in practice as well? And then we're starting to move on to this. We're starting to get some evidence now of prehistoric industry. So we're starting to get that. But can we do more? Can we actually look at this on a wider scale and think about long-term impacts? Can we think, you know, is there like an industrial revolution in the Iron Age? Does it have a signal? Does it have a chemical signal in peat bogs that we can look into? Tim Marr's been working on this sort of thing across Europe. There's not been so much work done in Scotland on this. We've done some work on a lock sequence in Orkney, but can we put it wider? Can we tie in this charcoal evidence with the heavy metal evidence as well? Can we tie that in with woodland evidence in terms of pollen records? Again, lots and lots of potential with this sort of thing, and because we're starting to get this evidence now in the Highlands, it's something we can potentially expand on. And then the last one, just to consider really, is we haven't said a lot about the post-medieval landscape at all. The only time I've really mentioned it is the Laird project, where they've got the 18th and 19th century building, and they've got some agricultural evidence, but we've got loads of shieling evidence. And I know there's been sort of shieling projects kickstarted here and there, but can we look at this as well in terms of, that grazing impact that we see on the landscape? Can we look at it through a combination of pollen records from around different sites, together with pollen records from close to the shieldings? You can see in old maps we've got lots of evidence of agriculture in the landscape, so we should have charred grain evidence somewhere. What evidence do we have for fuel? What does this say about life in these shieldings? This transhumance way of living, or is it actually more year-long in places as well? And then lastly, because I love charcoal so much, also think about charcoal burning platforms. We've got loads of evidence for charcoal burning platforms, but we don't do very much work at all on looking at the charcoal fragments from these. So can we see evidence for all these branches that we see? How is that impacting on the landscape? Can we tie this into pollen records, for example? Was it done in a sustainable way, or was it just a question of felling, lots of trees and using them in an unsustainable way? And this, we don't have to do much excavation for these. They're quite shallow in order to get this information. And there's lots of work that goes on this in places like France and in Europe. Very little goes on in Scotland, yet we have all this post-medieval archaeology scattered across our landscape. So maybe we could have a focus on that. There's lots of focus on prehistory, and we do have all that, but there's not much that goes on in terms of the post-medieval. And again, you can combine this with archival research as well, and I've got a PhD student that's doing that kind of work at the minute. So that's where I'll leave it. I'd like to thank everybody who's contributed slides for this, and not all my slides, I haven't made them all myself. I had lots of people that have given up time to make those. That's been fantastic. Lots of work going on, lots of institutions, and it's great actually when you look at that to see how many universities, Scottish universities, are actually doing work in the Highlands. They're embedded in Scotland, and yes, they do work in far-flung places, but they're also doing lots of interesting work across the Highlands region. And also, there's archaeology units out there. Again, they're doing important work. AOC at Clactol is one example of that. And again, the work that Coralie and Anna are doing as well in the dendrochronology. So that's that. I've put on some references for the work that I've been talking about that you can go and find if you want to. So if you need copies of that, you can either ask me via email, or I'm sure Susan will have these as well. And if you can't get copies of these, then just email me and I should be able to send you copies of them. Okay, thanks very much. I'll just stop sharing now.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Scott. That was a huge range of disciplines, and it's great to hear about all the collaboration that's going on as well. You were
Oh, I don't know, you seem to have crashed.
Yes, either. It does look like she's crashed. Well, I'll take over there, Scott, while Kirsty's on pause until she comes back. Are you catching me at all?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I'll kick off then the questions, because we've got one coming in already from Althea Davies. She says, really interesting, thanks, Scott. And is biomolecular evidence being combined with paleo records? So, for example, human diet from skeletal isotopes, use of vessels through lipids, or diversity using seeder DNA?
Yeah, so I haven't really spoken about all that sort of thing, but in a way, yes. So, for example, looking at isotopic records from human bone, we can look at diet evidence, and that is taking place to some extent across sites. It's not really been done so much in the Highlands, I don't think, but we can look at that in terms of looking at terrestrial diet. So how much things like plant-based food are they eating compared to meat-based food, although even that is up in the air at the minute, because essentially what we're finding is that if you've heavily manured your cereal crops and then before you consume them, obviously the stages in between, then it can also give you a signal that looks very much like you're consuming meat. So there are corrections still to be looked at in terms of that data. There's other kinds of molecular activity that are going on at the minute. There's sediment DNA evidence, which is just starting to come through now, and it's been used on some of the sites, the Crannog sites, and Dumfries and Galloway. There's starting to be a bit of that work being done in Orkney as well. There's lipid residues as well on things like pottery too, to kind of look to see what do they contain. Is it mainly plant-based material or is it animal fats, etc. There's also starch analysis on quernstones and that to look, is it actually cereals that are being ground, or is it other crops? And indeed in places like Ireland, they found evidence for things like pig nut tubers and things being ground rather than just being grain. So yeah, there's a whole multitude of different studies that can be taking place at the minute. It's there's lots of different science that can be thrown at things.
Great! Wow, that is a huge amount of work, isn't it? It's amazing. I've just got a comment here, just saying Tony Brown is also running a project looking at DNA in sedimentary records in the historic period. So there is great potential to exploit these approaches. Which, yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that as well.
Sediment DNA in a minute. It's DNA's. It's quite interesting being somebody who does pollen, because pollen's kind of looked at now as kind of an old science, even though we're still learning to understand the records that we're looking at. And you've got an influx of lots of these kind of not so much newer sciences, but newer ways of approaching archaeological sites. So sediment DNA is one of them. We've just done a study, some sediment DNA evidence in Orkney, working with the University of Warwick. And sediment DNA is a bit like waterlogged plant remains in a way, is that when you take those samples through your core, you're only getting sediment DNA of plants that are within, 2 centimeters or something of your site. It's got a very, very, very small catchment area. So you're only going to pick up plant remains and potentially animal fecal material that's very close to your sampling site. Tony Brown and colleagues at Southampton University have been working with Anne and Graham on this at some of the Crannog sites. And what they've been finding is they've been finding really good evidence for animal DNA and plant-based DNA, but the samples they've been taking are pretty much through midden material. So the DNA work is actually lining up very well with the animal bone evidence that they've got as well. And often with the plant-based DNA, you can't actually get it down to species level as much as you could do with waterlogged plant remains. So it's in its infancy and it's going to get better and hopefully it'll get cheaper. But I would, as an advocate for waterlogged plant remains, I would say that a lot of the information you can get from waterlogged plant remains. So, we should be doing more waterlogged plant remains through some of our vegetational histories as well.
Great. Thank you, Scott. I've also got a question from Ian, our Historic Environment Record Officer. And let me just find it. Okay. Ian says, this is a bit of a wish list here, Scott. If someone were to fund 2 or 3 major research projects, what would your priorities be?
Oh, blimey.
Time to put your marker down here, Scott. You can anything you like.
Well, interestingly, I was looking at I was lucky enough to go to Stratford Kildonnan a while back to give a talk there to the Timesman, and they were looking across there, the Strath, all the different archaeology there is there, and there is a big post-medieval landscape, but there's also other evidence, and I think that kind of landscape survey tied in with things like charcoal, pollen, all the kind of information we've been talking about, and thinking about how people have utilised that landscape through time. So going back to things like the LEG project, they're really useful in giving, such an overview of different periods, but also looking at, one area of landscape in lots of detail. And often we have information coming through from lots of different places, and we try to synthesize it as best we can and sort of contrast and compare. But going into lots of detail in one place can provide lots of information in terms of how people are living in that landscape, how people view that landscape. So coming back to cultural significance of landscape, ownership of landscape, how you might feel part of a landscape, how that landscape changes through time, and how people are utilising different resources of that landscape through time. So are there periods where it's heavily grazed? Are there periods where there's woodland regeneration? Has the woodland always been the same, etc.? So, I think that's the kind of project. I think the Leg project really set a high standard, and to be able to kind of repeat something like that in a different area would be pretty nice. And the Stratford Cildonnan is a pretty nice place and has lots of nice resources.
It certainly is. It's one of my favourite spots. Certainly, yeah, it's a great place. I just noticed that Kirsty has managed to find her way back online. But before I hand back to Kirsty, I've got a question just to put to you, if you don't mind. I've just sort of, as part of your presentation, what sort of came across for me was that the whole sort of field seems to be principally driven by academic research, or sort of like your sort of community-led projects with commercial archaeology companies sort of involved, or so sort of through universities as well. So do you think that we should be requiring this type of data collection more through developer-led commercial archaeology? And I'm sort of thinking specifically of wind farms, but also some of the larger housing developments as well. And on the back of that, is it an expensive process to actually go through?
Expensive in terms of getting information from
expensive in terms of money to pay for somebody to come along and do it and analyze the results and write the report.
I think Susan will tell you more about that in terms of the data she's collecting for the Highland Archaeological Research Framework. I think hopefully the talk actually shows that there's lots of cross collaboration going on in the area, and we've had, I sent this out a call to everybody I could think of that worked in the area. Some people have got back and some people haven't, but given the current situation and how busy I imagine a lot of people are, I think that's fine. One thing that I was doing when I was thinking about this talk and when I was putting this information together is that it'd be nice maybe to think about having some kind of symposium, maybe on themes such as could widen this out into other types of environmental archaeology as well. And inviting people from all these different places along to talk about what's going on, and then you can start seeing the overlaps and see where people research interests cross and everything as well. What's interesting and may not come through actually very much in this is that a lot of this work has been generated from HAF conferences. So the work in We Digs has been generated because I attended a HAF conference and heard Anna Welty talk. Interest in charcoal burning platforms and that across this area from hearing Jonathan Wordsworth talk, knowing about the amount of interesting stuff that's going on in Clacton that AOC are doing is because Andy Heald came and gave a talk at the conference as well. So a lot of this actually has been driven by HAF. So it's it could be seen as a very good catalyst for all of this work that's going on. And it could be that these kind of symposia and things come out the back of these kind of talks as well, to give more people a chance. But HAF is kind of doing that in a way as well. But you could always have an environmental HAF afternoon or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm gonna hand back to Kirsty if she's there. Are you there, Kirsty?
I am here. I hope my connection stays. It's cutting in and out. Am I still here?
Yes.
Again? I am. So okay, that's great. I think just following on from what Andy was saying at the beginning there, Scott, if we can ask developers who are, say they're doing big wind farms and they are already, as part of that, having archaeological survey done, if they routinely include some sort of paleo-environmental work, would that be beneficial to the data that you hold as well? I mean, is it, we have to be able to say that it's reasonable and justifiable to be able to ask for that every time. But I'm thinking we're probably missing a trick by not asking for that in every case, whether or not there are sites in the area. Yeah,
it was a few things, I guess, in terms of sort of developer funded work. And Coralie will tell you about this as well in terms of the dendrochronological work. And it's often that things are funded to different stages. So, for example, my freezer, not at home, my freezer at work, is full of pollen cores from peat bogs that no longer exist because there's now a road that goes through them, or there's a Tesco's on top of them or something. And Coralie's the same. So the work in that instance part of the the scheme of investigation was to see how deep the bog is, how old the bog is. So we have cores, we have radiocarbon dates, and then in terms of then doing the pollen work, that funding never came through. So if I threw these cores away, that's it. There's no record of those bogs ever again. You're never going to go back and be able to take a sample of it. It's the same for dendro. So some of the buildings that have these amazing dendrochronological records, they're being demolished, and there's no investigation of the timbers that are within them. Or sometimes there is, written down that there's going to be an investigation, and then it never happens. So it's difficult sometimes to take it all the way through. Often things go through initial stages of prospection, and then when it comes to the analysis stage, they never quite reach it. And then there's different levels of post-excavation as well. If you go back a few years, decade or so ago, the post-excavation money that was there was quite high for projects, and now it's not so high for projects. So you're limited in terms of the scope of what you can do as well. But all of that sort of what you would do would all be in the written scheme of investigation for these projects. So it's just a question of seeing how far that goes and then trying to get the results when they come out. I think I've lost Kirsty again.
Oh no! Right. Okay. Well, I know there's one more question, Scott, which I'm going to go to Ian again. Ian has another question for you, and then I think after that we'll probably wrap up and let everyone go and get a glass of wine or or something. So, Ian, over to you. Last question of the night.
Yeah. Hi, Scott. It's interesting. You mentioned the quite like to work in the Strath of Kildon, because a lot of the new sites that I've been finding are just on aerial photographs. Actually, I'm finding loads of new sites that haven't been recorded, especially sort of maybe late medieval, post-medieval farmsteads and things. They're all over the place, and prehistoric sites as well. So actually, it's as though you could say it's as good a place as any. Actually, there are a lot of new sites that we've never had recorded on the HER before. But the question was really related to the HER. The studies that you had on your maps earlier in your talk. There's a lot of sort of published articles or specific research projects that are being sort of used for those sort of studies and pulling together for the information. Do you think there's any scope actually looking back more at the grey literature in the historic environment records? I know you mentioned some of the bigger, more recent development sites like Culduthel and sites like that, but do you think there's that locked up in the HER? Do you think there's more potential to tease out perhaps more data than has been?
Yeah, definitely. When Rosie was doing those reviews of the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, one of the things she did was ask all the companies for their grey literature, so she could go through and find those records, because some of it is kind of hidden away and potentially difficult to get hold of. But I think there is always a willing by companies to share data with you. A lot of the time, it's just catching them at a time when they're not massively busy, because they go from project to project, and it may not be that the work you're asking for could take time to pull out, and they might not have that time to do it maybe in a oneer, so you might get drip fed it. But yeah, I'm sure there is. And if you look at some of the work that Richard Bradley's written about in terms of the value of developer funded archaeology and just how much information that's bringing to the fore, it's really good. And we do archaeology to a really high level in Scotland, and we shouldn't forget that. So we do get lots of good information. It's sometimes that, well, there's that, and then there's also, if you know about those sites and if you know about what they have been able to do in post-ex, because they might have a restricted budget, you can see if those samples are still available. And one of the things, at the minute, we're always looking at, well, what new work is going on in terms of where people are out, where people are coring, etc. But there must be a massive repository now of material that's hardly been looked at and could add lots of value. The pollen cores in my freezer, for example, but also sometimes different methods are done to different standards. So if you look at child plant remains in archaeobotany, if you're doing an excavation of a site, there will be an archaeobotany report, and that archaeobotany report will pretty much tell you, the cultivars, etc., that are there. The charcoal may not have been looked at very much because it's a different kind of, it might be a different skill set. Well, it is a different skill set, but also it may have been that a few fragments have been identified for radiocarbon dating. Maybe a couple of fragments have been looked at in terms of just giving an overview of what tree types, but they might not have been done to the saturation level. So you may not have 100 fragments being analysed from a site. You might have 20, 30. That's not the whole story. And you might not have things like ring curvature being looked at, evidence of fungal hyphae, evidence of tool marks, evidence of insect activity, radial cracks, all these sort of things. So things like charcoal, there must be massive, massive potential to actually go back and look at some of these assemblages. So I think it's quite right. It's great having that conversation, thinking about using those grey literature, and then getting an idea of, well, how much potential is there still in these sites? And you could really start putting together really decent projects by combining a few of these sites, looking at a certain theme. So it might be metalworking and looking at seeing, what woodland evidence there is for impact. It could be looking at wild food resources in the Neolithic. It could be looking at evidence of fuel use in the post-medieval period in terms of turf versus wood. All of these things. One thing that we haven't really picked up on today, yet there must be quite good evidence out there, is also things like driftwood use and stuff like that, non-native species. So the only time we've kind of mentioned it is through the dendrochronological work. So there's loads of potential out there to do lots of good stuff. It's just kind of getting an idea of what's out there. And I think if you've got the right research question, and then you go into those kind of archives and have those conversations with people, that's when you'll start seeing those resources coming through and maybe more work being done on them.
Great. It's just masses and masses of potential, and so many avenues that we really do need to explore. It's really, really quite fascinating. So it just leaves me to say a massive thank you to Scott for your presentation. I'm sure you all enjoyed it as much as I did, and an even bigger apology that you all had to unexpectedly put up with me. Sorry about that. And thank you to you all for coming and spending your evening with us. It is really very much appreciated.